I'm Sharon Barnes-Waters, and welcome to CityViews, the show about people, places, and things that make New York great. Well, my guest today has been a champion of civil rights. He has fought for gender equality, social and economic justice. He marched in Selma and fought side by side with Dr. Martin Luther King as they faced the tyranny of Jim Crow. And yes, he's even ran for president of the United States. His work continues through his Rainbow Push Coalition that's having a 3-day summit in New York next month. I am honored to welcome today the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a civil rights leader and activist.
Good morning,
Thank
Sharon.
you.
Thank you very much.
It's such an honor and a pleasure, and I know you've been to New York many times. Your activism has led you to our great city.
I'm intimidated at 1010 News.
All right, we are happy that you're a listener. And you know, because you know what I said, there was so much stuff that you have done throughout your lifetime. I kind of have to jump in with 2 feet here and ask you, how do you view the political climate right now in the United States? I just have to ask that.
In an ugly, divisive climate, we've overcome so much that we're going back to, it seems. I grew up born in Greenville, South Carolina. At the time when African-American soldiers, my father had to sit behind lots of POWs on American military bases. We didn't have the right to use hotels, motels, parks, libraries. We overcame that. And we've seen the kind of growth, people doing a difficult thing from surviving apart to learning how to live together. When I look at the big Clemson-Alabama football game with 2 black quarterbacks and Clemson from South Carolina and Alabama from Tuscaloosa, it's symbolic of the progress we made in that sense. But then this has been a very ugly campaign season, trying to take away the legitimacy of President Barack Obama. He was not born here. So he founded ISIS, a terrorist organization, which is not true, calling Hillary Clinton a crook and a nasty woman, banning Muslims, attacking.
So it's
been an ugly season, and then even an ugly campaign in the election process, because the winner lost and the loser won, created some consternation. Hillary got 3 million more votes, and then they said, but she's not winner because of the Electoral College built upon the slave formula. That's what that's built upon.
And that's the law. That's how we elect our
the law,
presidents.
but it's unjust law, just like 350 Human was unjust law. And then you had the case of the Russian hacking factor. We don't know the depths of it yet. And then you had the FBI factor. But what was not dealt with much was voter suppression.
Well, we're talking about, he's talking about voter fraud. You're talking about voter suppression?
Yeah, there's no evidence of the fraud. There's a lot of evidence of the suppression. So much so the Justice Department had to intervene to stop it in Texas and North Carolina and Michigan and Wisconsin and North Dakota. And the evidence, those who denied the right to vote have sought to nullify it ever since we've had the right to vote. So these tensions remain, and we should be going forward by hope, but there's lots of anxiety in the air.
So what are you saying? Are you saying, like some others, like John Lewis, that he is an illegitimate president, or he's legitimate and let's try and build bridges?
Well, he's legal, but the moral legitimacy is out for question because it's not a fair process. And that's why when he raised the issue, he questions his own legitimacy by saying fraud is involved. We say suppression is involved. So if he wants to conduct a hearing, let it involve fraud and suppression to see kind of how it comes out. We know, for example, that when the 65 Voting Rights Act was undermined in 2013 in Shelby, Alabama, that they moved 868 precincts, making voting more difficult. We were in North Carolina during the campaign, and they removed voting precincts off of college campuses. One school with 7,000 students had to go 3 miles down the road just to vote. These inconveniences were factors in diminishing voting access, and the courts had to rule against voter ID and other kinds of schemes, stop Sunday voting, stop weekend voting. So it's been ugly, and so while we try to go forward, the president keeps kind of bringing us back.
So are you saying, are we a nation divided? Because people will say, we have had 8 years of an African-American president, and they feel that the racial tensions have just widened, and it should have been opposite, having an African-American president.
Well, there was such a rebellion against his victory. I remember when he was inaugurated, the biggest crowd in American history at an inauguration, just a couple of million people. The Republicans were planning that day, how do we undercut him? Now, here's the fact. He inherited a situation where we'd gone from a budget surplus with tax cuts down to a budget deficit. We lost 800,000 jobs that month. We didn't lose a single job a month during his 8 years. We gained every month, sometime more, sometime less. 20 million Americans health insurance, we never had it before. The auto industry came back with a risk investment that paid off. We were able to get a climate deal worked out in France with the nations of the Western world. We're able to get Iran off a nuclear trajectory. And so he has a legacy that is worth upholding, and yet there are those who are obsessed with trying to destroy the legacy. And so many people who fought against it are now needed the most. In other words, they talk about Obamacare. Sharon, there's no such thing as Obamacare. That's not a law. It's Affordable Care. And they use Obamacare as a kind of pejorative label. So there are some people who really want Affordable Care Act. They want the mammograms and the pap test. They want the pre-existing condition test. They want to be on insurance till they're 26, but they don't want Obamacare.
But even the president said if there is something that you see that you can make it better, improve on the health care.
Which means mend it but don't end it. That's really what that means. If you see something that needs to be adjusted, adjust it, but don't destroy the idea that people, based upon need, not based upon money, should have more health care. But there are those who want affordable care but don't want Obamacare. They want omelet but don't want eggs.
So who's going to be hurt? Who do you think is going to be hurt more by them not having their ducks in a row and repealing it first? You think repeal, replace?
The poorest people will hurt the most, because those who are making these decisions about cutting it or gutting it themselves are insured. And ironically, more Trump supporters are affected than Barack Obama supporters, because the very nature of the demographics of our country. But whether health care should not be based upon race, it should be based upon need.
Then how do we bridge the divide? Because you've always said, keep hope alive. Is there hope here?
Well, in some sense, the president is now the captain of the ship. But the winds of hope will determine which way the ship will sail. And the winds of hope are sailing. You saw the inauguration on Monday, but you saw the huge demonstration on Saturday.
Not just the United States,
around the world. And what they were really saying is that there's a lot of fear. Women fear their right to self-determination will be taken away from them. Others fear the secession, their right to vote will be diminished from them. Others fear that they will not be able to get livable wages. Others fear that we might end up in unnecessary wars. They fear they may be sent across the border back into Mexico under conditions that are not favorable. The Muslims will be banned, so lots of fear. But yet those people came together on the hope that in coming together they would be able to go forward. And I was very impressed with the spirit of that march. No violent acts, where people churn to each other, and not only each other, but the spirit of hope, and that hope must sustain us.
So looking back 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when you started protesting, you said the segregation in the South. How did you, as a young boy in Greenville, decide to move from, okay, this is what society says, this is it. What did you feel and experience that said to you, let me move to political action? Because even though we've had all these protests, does not the protests have to lead to some political action to get anything done?
Often we internalize the system we're born in. And I grew up in rigid legal segregation. You either adjust or you resent it and wish that you could change it, but you don't have the power, or you learn to resist. When I was an 18-year-old high school student and came home from college and couldn't use the public library, I determined that summer I would try to use it, no matter what the cost was. So that summer, 8 of us went to use the public library. We were jailed trying to use the public library. And that kind of assumptions, in that situation, I was born again, so to speak, born again to fight for a kind of public dignity. It's not enough to survive. You have to fight for dignity, and that means willing to take the risk and to make the sacrifice, and ultimately to teach people to learn to live together. Because when it's real, and you got to get, while race is a big issue, learning to live beyond the limits of race is also a big deal, because you look at the poor, most poor people in America are not black or brown, they're white, they're female, they're young. Most poor folk are not on welfare, they work every day and still cannot make ends meet. So people need becomes ultimately the basis of organizing people for change.
And I have to ask you about something that was said recently, and that you tweeted your response. Our president talked about the violence in Chicago and bringing in the feds to control the carnage. And you tweeted out right away, we don't need a threat. We need a plan. Now, you're in Chicago. President Obama and the First Lady, former First Lady, are from Chicago, and people are saying, all you guys are there. Why is this going on in Chicago?
The carnage is real. Last year, 4,000 shot, 800 killed, guns in, drugs in, jobs out. But it's not just that carnage. 80,000 vacant homes, abandoned lots because banks foreclosed on people's homes, and public housing was closed and private housing foreclosed. They closed 50 public schools. It meant 5,000 teachers lost their jobs, and the home value went down in those areas. We have 8 communities where unemployment is 20+%, and where the average median income is $9,000 to $15,000. Lots of carnage. So we need the feds involved. The Federal Housing and Urban Development needs to come in.
That kind of Fed?
Yeah.
Not the National Guard?
The federal health care needs to come in. Okay. Because if you, for example, have a broad study on violence causes and cures, on gender and racial disparity, a plan the impact of poverty, and a commitment to growth. If you just remove lead and lead paint jobs, there's more lead paint in schools in Chicago than in Flint. If a commitment to cut down the weeds and the bushes, landscapers, jobs. If you're going to demolish those structures that cannot be rebuilt, jobs. Or rebuild that which can be rebuilt. So if you come in with a plan of reconstruction, that's important. Don't just use people's pain as a foil. But let's come in with a plan.
Do you think President Obama coming back to Chicago and is going to help in this area?
I don't know. He doesn't have the reins of government now, and he probably could have done more had he not faced such a violent headwind in the meantime. There's some unfinished business in urban America. Reconstruction is unfinished business. When these banks hit us a few years ago, and 9 million to 10 million homes were lost, the banks use subprime lending, predatory spending, predatory lending, and private mortgage investments, and they wrecked 10 million homeowners in their neighborhoods. But the banks got bailed out, but not linked to lending or the reinvestment. So the banks now are washing capital. The people who lost their homes, for many of them that was their only business, they never recovered. So there's a whole body of people who never recovered from the recovery.
And I talked about it in your intro, you have such a legacy of fighting, and the fight continues today. You're still fighting. What do you think, we've talked about other challenges. Is there one single challenge that you think is a priority, or should we be working on all of it at the same time?
We work on multiple fronts, but the protected right to vote is the crown jewel of democracy. And when it is protected, democracy has integrity. When it is made vulnerable to some schemes, it undermines it. And the New York Times indicated on November the 9th, the first time we've had an election in the last 50 years without the protected right to vote. And the result is we saw calamities. We saw, in these 50 years, we saw a loss of progress. In the last 2 years, we saw precincts removed. We saw attempts to stop easy access in the courts. We saw the attempt to stop Sunday voting, weekend voting. And so the protected right becomes a big deal. As a matter of fact, we have 50 elections as opposed to one. It's one election day. We need a constitutional right to vote. We only have a state's right to vote. Second, of course, is health care. People need health care. You cannot predict when you will get sick, nor how long you'll be sick, nor its cost. No one cause of bankruptcy is unpredictable medical situations. The third would be a job. People want to work, and then they'd be trained skills to work. And if we're given an opportunity, people do work. But more people are working poor. They work, but they're still poor. They work, but they can't make ends meet. People need a livable wage, at least $15 an hour.
And you have been in the trenches. Who are the civil rights leaders of today? Who's following in your footsteps? Who are
well,
they?
the NAACP remains our big ship. You know, the Urban League and Mr. Brooks, NAACP, Reverend Sharpton, National Action Network. You have the impact of Mr. Brooks and Mr. At Urban League, Moriel. You have the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Latino Caucus, LULAC. I mean, there's a whole body of organization that sprung up the last few years that all have impact. For example, we had this gigantic march, the Global March, this past weekend in Washington, and it was not identifiable faces. It was a movement based upon need and a sense of urgency. And so many people now, with a clear message, can gain the following and maintain it.
Do you think that President Trump has taken note of the protest throughout the United States and throughout the world? And what is your message to the president?
I'm not sure he has. If you wake up one morning, Sharon, and you're the most powerful person in the world, you have two options. One, you can, with grace and kindness, you can enhance your power. With arrogance and meanness, you can have your power diminish. They say that pride precedes the fall. Rather than seeking to convene that leadership to find out why are you guys protesting, he's chosen to marginalize them and say they were not as many as they were. But those women who are fighting for pay equity and gender equality, the need for an equal rights amendment, those voices should be heard, not diminished. Those who feel the Voting Rights Act would be, the Voting Rights Action access would be undermined, should be heard. Those workers who want livable wages should be heard. Those who want, who fear being deported in some kind of national roundup scheme, or those Muslims who fear they'll be banned, or refugees will be banned. Those collective fears must be heard, and if they're heard, you can turn those fears into hope and new possibilities.
Did seeing those protesters somehow remind you of the protests back in the civil rights era in the 50s?
Well, it did. It reminded me so much of this of 63.
Because there were faces of all the people, all
multiracial, multicultural. Reminded me of the '63 march, and it was a sense of hope. It's interesting that those who won on Friday seemed to be anxious and afraid. Those who lost seemed to be full of hope. There was a certain buoyancy there Saturday. There was a certain multiracial, gender, racial equality struggles, people fighting for, we demand to go forward by hope, we'll not go backwards by fear. There was a sense of people down but moving up. And I got that kind of up feeling from the demonstration on Saturday. And I was glad it remained all around the world nonviolent. It was nonviolent because violence is a distraction. Violence is a diversion. Nonviolence is full of hope and healing, and you go forward by nonviolence because what you're fighting for.
So we have hope.
And the hope lies in those who are attached to the wind of hope and change. You know, when Rosa Parks sat down, she was not represented by the governor, by the legislature, by the Congress, but she had behind her back the wind of hope and change. That wind of hope and change cannot be stopped by governments. Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi, she represented the wind of hope and change as she sought to sit down in Atlantic City, New Jersey, in '64 for the Democratic Convention. Dr. King, without her standing up, had the wind of hope. And there is a hope now. There is a desire for creative, constructive change that cannot be stopped by political schemes.
And as you mentioned, Rosa Parks, we have to tell you that we had Claudette Colvin in here last month as we honor her, and she was the young lady.
A brilliant woman. You know, during those days, they would pick and choose who they wanted to project as a model that could take the hit. So Rosa Parks was not the first who sat down. Claudette Colvin sat down, but she had the community credentials they felt that were defensible, and so she sat down.
She was 15 years old. It was 9 months before Rosa Parks that she had taken her seat.
That's right.
And the Browder versus Gale case, that led to the desegregation of the buses. So people, no matter what age,
it was so much connection. I asked Rosa Parks one time, I said, Mrs. Parks, why didn't you go to the back of the bus? Like, really? I mean, you could have been beaten, you could have been thrown off the bus. She said, I started to go back, but I thought about Emmett Till, I couldn't go back. So this was December the 1st. Emmett Till was lynched August 28th, just 3 months before. And so even from death, Emmett Till said, go forward by healing and hope. And she did so with an amazing sense of dignity and grace that captured the heartstrings of many people around the nation. She was testing the 54 decision. Thurgood Marshall and that group had led the decision to make Jim Crow illegal in 54, and she and Attorney Fred Gray were testing that case.
Right.
And
so the Supreme Court.
The victory was in 55 with the boycott. The real victory was in 56 when the courts ruled that they were right, and that made it national not just Montgomery.
I love to tell the Claudette Colvin story because it's a story that really doesn't.
Too few people know her.
Yes, and you know, we talk about the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, and we're hoping that they too, you know, because that's such an important institution that we have now to tell our story, and it is our wish that they will also
Claudette Colvin,
find a place for her
for
there.
those who don't know, Claudette Colvin sat down before Mrs. Parks sat down on the bus, and she was younger, and the press did not touch it, and she was not arrested. Rosa Parks was arrested. I remember when we brought Dr. King to Greenville, South Carolina, my hometown, back in '67 to support some bakery workers who were striking, and the press didn't cover it. It was a way of covering it up by not covering it at all. So in some sense, Claudette Colvin sat down, she got no press coverage. Mrs. Parks did get press coverage, and
she was the face of the movement.
The face of the movement.
The face of the movement. But we're still hoping that the museum will find a place in there for Claudette
Well,
Colvin.
the museum kind of takes us back to the roots of America's real history. We think about slavery and Mississippi and the like, but the big slave quarters was in New York. That's why you have a burial ground.
That's why we have
a
it
burial
right
ground here in New York. That's why the commodities exchange. Blacks were the commodities to be exchanged. America's #1 trade was slave trade. When I heard that many candidates referred to 240-year-old democracy, they were referring to the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Blacks were here 157 years before Declaration of Independence. So we were enslaved for 246 years. It separates us from the tradition of immigrants or refugees. We came enslaved, bought, sold, and worked without wages. No other ship bore that cargo. And then another 80 years of Jim Crow where 5,000 blacks were lynched without one indictment. And then it took an Emancipation Proclamation and a 54 Supreme Court decision to break us out of that situation. That's why the unfinished business of that ship, unlike we came with the difference. We're in the same ship now. No, we're not in the same. We're not in the same ship now. Big Super Bowl game, Sharon, in a few days, with as much creativity as blacks have. We've done one ad for Super Bowl in 51 years.
Economic Summit coming up.
And that's
tell
summit.
us about the Economic Summit next
Well,
month.
is that after all these years, we're free but not equal. We want equal access to automobile dealerships. 20,000 dealerships, blacks and browns got less than 400. We want equal opportunity. We want not just freedom but equality. In the telecommunication industry or in the banking industry, now they're going to deregulate the banks again, but they might try to deregulate justice and take away affirmative action and equal opportunity and equal access. When the banks went down, rather than admitting that it was greed, they said Community Reinvestment Act is why they went down. They had to give deference to people who couldn't afford to pay their loans. The fact is, people could not afford to pay the onerous condition under which the loans were made. So I hope that Mr. Trump will not allow in deregulation for justice and progress to be deregulated.
Because when I look at the kinds of topics that you have, you're going to have an education day, you're going to have the next generation of athletes, deal makers, generational diversity, hip hop and the millennials, diversity report card, a call to action, healthcare.
Well,
you have a slew of things going on.
We've taken some athletes down to the New York Stock Exchange to see how the works. How do you make that big money for 4 or 5 years?
Right.
Because if you make it fast and spend it fast,
broke,
won't last. So we've been having some workshops with athletes for life beyond the playing field. Also, we challenged Silicon Valley, had 136 board members, 34 white women, 3 blacks, and 1 Latino. We challenged them. They've begun to open up, but they said they couldn't find brown engineers. Well, they can't find them at UCLA or USC because they're not coming out because they're not getting in. 42% of all black engineers come from HBCUs. They come from Morgan State and Hampton, Howard, A&T, and Tennessee State and Southern University. And so we have interns now going from those schools to Silicon Valley and coming to Wall Street, learning the science of capital. We're teaching young children the science of capital, the stock market game. What's a bear? What's a bull? How do you measure your worth by investing and saving, not spending? Every time I hear somebody, people spend $1 trillion a year. You're not measured by how much you spend, how much you invest and save and leverage.
Absolutely. So the summit is
February 15th through 17th.
And you're having some notable people here also, Honorable Charles Schumer, Honorable Charles Rangel, Honorable Scott Stringer. They're all participating, and so many more participating in this.
We're trying to get a deal with Congressman, Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. We're trying to get him to come. He's tentatively committed along with Senator Schumer because with the infrastructure commitment made by President Trump, with that $3 to $6 trillion in offshore tax havens, we're going to bring that money back under conditions that allow them to target to invest in these cities. For example, we need cities rebuilt, not walls built, as a matter of fact. We need to deal with the issue of lack of health care and education and job preparation for the global competition. And so one workshop would be that of Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, we hope, and that of Senator Chuck Schumer on how we use those infrastructure monies. And Chairman, it's a big deal because Flint was kind of highlighted last year with the lead paint situation, but that lead in the paint and lead water is in all these major eastern cities where the countries were built first. It's a real health hazard.
All right. So I just want our viewers and our listeners to know that your economic summit, it's the annual Rainbow Push Wall Street Project Economic Summit. It's its 20th anniversary.
February 15th to 17th.
And there's so many things here when I read through this.
Well, one thing we did, Sharon, we were able to get the New York Stock Exchange to honor Dr. King's birthday. It didn't honor it for a long time. It honors it now.
It honors it now.
But more than that, there are deals to be made. How do you green line the red line zones? Well, you have these pension funds, the state and local and county pension funds and union pension funds and teachers pension funds, church pension funds, to take some of those monies that come from the people to invest where the people live, invest so people can grow. Most of these big, tall buildings in downtown America, this is pension fund money. This is not some money out of somebody's bank account. And you live in the most successful, move on to the next level and begin to deal with other forms of capital development.
Wow. Well, I want to make sure that we give everyone the website and the phone number where you can register, and it's www.rainbowpushwallstreetproject.org, or you can call 646-569-5889. I'll say that again, rainbowpushwallstreetproject.org, or call 646-569-5889. And the summit is for 3 days, February 15th through the 17th.
At the Hyatt.
At the Hyatt.
Grand Hyatt. Let me say quickly, this is the fourth stage of the struggle to make America inclusive. If the first stage was to end legal slavery, as I said, the second stage to end legal Jim Crow, the third stage is the right to vote, the fourth stage is access to capital, and industry, and technology, and deal flow. And that's why Wall Street is the capital of capital. We must have access to that capital in order to be able to invest and break the cycle of poverty and second-class citizenship for all Americans.
Well, Reverend Jackson, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to be with us on a personal note, because you have done, and civil rights leaders have done what you have done. I can sit in this seat and I can do what I do. So I want to thank you for stopping by CityViews and sharing your thoughts.
Keep hope alive.
Keep hope alive.
Remember, you don't drown because the water's deep. You drown because you stop kicking.
I'm kicking.
Don't stop kicking.
Thank you.